Following up on the wacky history of cell theory that you just watched, we're going to talk a little bit more about cell theory. So, as it said in the video, until microscopes were invented, scientists couldn't even see cells. They didn't even know that they existed. But the three parts of cell theory, just to go back, are: one, all organisms are composed of one or more cells. And the definition of organism is a living thing. Two, the cell is the basic unit of structure and organization in organisms. And three, all cells come from pre-existing cells. So the cell is fundamental to life. The cell is the smallest thing that can be considered living. So if a cell can be considered living, then it itself needs to have those 5 characteristics. So the first one being made of cells. Well, cells aren't exactly made of cells. They're made of organelles, but let's skip to the next one. Obtaining and using energy. Living things are able to gain energy by eating or by taking in energy from the sun, like plants when they photosynthesize. In order to survive and to function, living things must use the energy they have obtained. Obtaining and using energy is only possible with cells. To see why this is true, let's contrast this characteristic of living things against something that's not living and therefore has no cells, like a rock. I guess you could say that a rock obtains energy when the sun makes the rock hot, but the rock has no system in place to capture that heat energy and save it and use it for a different function. A rock isn't going to use heat energy from the sun to grow larger or to reproduce. Only living things are able to obtain and use energy. This ability to store and to change energy is possible because living things are made of cells. And we are going to talk more about that process. Respond to the environment. Living things can respond to different situations because they are made of cells. So again, let's compare this characteristic with a rock. Obviously, a rock does not have the ability to move away from something that might cause it harm. If a rock wanted to be colder or hotter, it would not be able to move to a location where its temperature would change, nor would the rock be able to use its internal energy to heat or cool itself. In living things, however, cells create the ability to initiate movement and to respond to an environment. So in this picture, we have the cells responding specifically to an invader, an infection. The cells sense the infection and they're just moving in to take care of it. Grow and develop. Because of cells, living things are able to grow and develop. Inside every cell, there's a system that controls the cell's development. When a cell needs to grow, it sends out messages through this system, which causes cell growth to occur. A rock, on the other hand, can only change its size when it is subject to environmental processes like erosion. A rock cannot make these changes by itself. And reproduce. Not only do cells themselves reproduce, reproduction is controlled by a chemical message in cells. An organism without enough energy to support its own needs would not have enough energy to support the growth of an offspring. So that's an example of, say, a female who is not eating enough food, perhaps suffering from an eating disorder, or, there are people who live in areas of the world where they don't have enough food to eat, and their menstrual cycles actually stop. They stop having their period because they are not able to support growth of another life. So their energy needs to support their own life. Does a rock have the same problem? No. A rock, which is not made of cells, cannot reproduce. The only situation in which we might think of a rock being able to reproduce would be if the earth shifted and caused the rock to break into smaller pieces. But that's not reproduction. You wouldn't argue that by breaking a donut in half, you now have 2 donuts. You've simply broken a donut in half. Only living things are able to reproduce, and true reproduction is only possible with the help of cells. So, going back, life requires all of these processes within a cell. But not only does the cell allow us to obtain and use energy, the cell itself obtains and uses energy. Because it is a living thing, it also does this thing. Not only do cells allow us to respond to the environment, but the cell itself responds to the environment because it is a living thing. Not only does a cell allow us to grow and to develop, but the cell itself grows and develops. Like we were saying in class, perhaps, maybe we haven't said it yet, but you have far more cells now than you did when you were a baby. You continue to grow cells. And your cells multiply and there are more of them. And they split and there are more of them. And so your cells themselves grow and develop. And the cells enable you to reproduce, but the cells themselves also reproduce. This is a process known as mitosis, where you get more cells. So cells are the basic unit of structure and organization in organisms. Basic meaning the lowest level of something that is alive. So in all living things that are organized, this is how we are organized. We are organized into cells. What kind of cells? Well, all kinds of cells. Skin cells, muscle cells, hair cells, nail cells, heart cells, liver cells. And that is how we are organized, by our kind of cell. Some organisms, well, we'll get to that in a couple of slides. Okay, and all cells come from pre-existing cells. You, the person watching and listening to this, you began as a single cell. And over time, your cells have grown and divided many times into many different cells. From the time of the ancient Romans until about the 1800s, people believed in something called spontaneous generation. People believed, for instance, that dirty clothing could lead to the development of mice. They would look at a pile of dirty rags in the corner and mice would come out of it and they'd say, mice just spontaneously came out of that clothing. I know that that was just clothing and there's a mouse. Today, the idea of clothing giving birth to a mouse sounds really weird, but it made sense to the people who believed in the theory, who saw the mice emerge from their dirty clothing. The problem with the theory of spontaneous generation is that according to the theory, a non-living thing, the clothing, had the ability to reproduce. And not only could it reproduce, but it could create something that was very different structurally, a mouse that was made out of cells. So here is one of the first experiments that disproved spontaneous generation. In those days, they also noticed that maggots, which are actually baby flies, they're the larva form, so they look like worms instead of flies, always appeared on rotting meat. So they assumed that the maggots were born out of the rotting meat. In 1668, an Italian physician and poet by the name of Francesco Redi tested this idea. He conducted an experiment where he left out some uncovered meat, some meat that was covered only with a cloth, and some meat that was completely covered. As the meat rotted, maggots were only found on the completely uncovered meat. the meat covered with a cloth and the completely covered, maybe with a plate or something, the completely covered meat, it rotted, but it had no maggots. He concluded that flies could not lay their eggs on the covered meat, and that was why the maggots did not appear on the other two pieces of meat that were covered. Reddy's meat experiment was one step that led us to understand that life doesn't spontaneously generate. Cells come from cells. People come from people. Mice come from mice. So these are the levels of organization. Atoms can combine to make molecules. Molecules can combine to make organelles. Organelles can combine to make cells. And here, this is where life begins. These are not alive. These can be defined as living. Cells combine to make tissues. So for instance, a bunch of muscle cells can combine to make muscle tissue, and that muscle tissue can combine to make an organ, a muscle organ like your heart. And then the organs can combine to make a whole organ system. This is your cardiopulmonary system, your heart and your lungs and all kinds of things. And then organ systems, multiple organ systems combine to make an organism. This one's combining to make a human, but it's the same no matter what kind of organism it is. We go from atoms to molecules to organelles to cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and organisms. So, although all living things are made of cells, organisms may be unicellular, composed of one cell, or multicellular, composed of many cells that may organize themselves into tissues, and the tissues organize into organs, and the organs organize into organ systems. This is an example of a unicellular organism. This is not an organism that is going to combine with other organisms and make a bigger organism. This is complete in itself. And this is, of course, an example of a multicellular organism. Cells are the most basic unit of life, the smallest part of an organism, still capable of all of life's processes, still showing all 5 characteristics of living things. But cells can be very diverse. Very often we see a single animal cell that looks a lot like this one, but not all animal cells look like this one. Muscle cells and hair cells look very different, even though they have all of the elements you see here. There are 2 types of cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. A prokaryote, which is a prokaryotic cell, is a microscopic single-celled organism. It has no distinct nucleus with a membrane. It has no specialized organelles. Prokaryotes include bacteria and cyanobacteria. Meanwhile, eukaryotes, which is a eukaryotic cell, a creature that has eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotes are organisms consisting of cells in which the genetic material is DNA in the form of chromosomes contained within a distinct nucleus. Eukaryotes include all of the living organisms other than eubacteria and archaebacteria. So, just a little rundown. Some of these things won't make full sense until we get farther into the unit, but do prokaryotes have a nucleus? No. Eukaryotes? Yes. Do prokaryotic cells have membrane-bound organelles? No. Eukaryotic cells? Yes. Do prokaryotic cells divide? How do they divide? Binary fission. How do eukaryotic cells divide? Mitosis. We will learn more about mitosis, not so much about binary fission. What size is a prokaryotic organism? It's unicellular, one cell, most often microscopic. Eukaryotic cells organisms can be unicellular or multicellular. Are there cell walls in the prokaryotic organism? Yes, the cell walls are made of Oh man, they're made of that. You would think I'd know how to say it. My tongue got twisted, guys. There are cell walls in eukaryotic cells, only in fungi and in plants, and they're made of chitin or cellulose. So an example of a prokaryotic organism is bacteria. An example of a eukaryotic organism. There are so many examples. Animals, plants, fungi, protists. Although there are two main kinds of cells, every kind of cell has genetic material, DNA or RNA, cytoplasm, which is a jelly-like liquid that everything floats in, a cell membrane, and ribosomes. So the genetic material is inside the nucleus for eukaryotic cells, but just kind of writhing in a prokaryotic cell. The cytoplasm is this jelly-like material and this jelly-like material. The cell membrane is the outside of a eukaryotic cell. Well, an animal cell. Plants and fungi have another layer outside of that. And it's, if you notice, this pink is pointing inside. It's not the outside yellow part, it's this inside blue. That's the cell membrane for the prokaryotic cell. And then ribosomes, these little dots and these little dots. So no matter what kind of cell it is, all cells have those four things. And that is what you need to know about cells and cell theory.